good afternoon, good evening, and welcome or welcome back, depending on where you're dialing from and whether this is your first or not. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte here in Canada, and have a distinct pleasure of leading Deloitte's Tech Executive program for Canada. And through that, had the pleasure to be host of this series of live webcasts that we have been bringing to our Canadian audiences now for the last 3 years. As many of you know, we are using this channel to introduce our Canadian audiences to Canadian tech leaders, people who are essentially shaping the future of our country through their technology decisions and choices. And we are also using this same channel to bring to you what we feel is useful, usable, relevant, timely insights. And today, it's one of those sessions. Today, we are going to talk and do a deeper dive into a just published study that we call Deloitte's Global Tech Leadership Study, in which we're going to explore what we have found, how the role of a technology leader, technology executive is evolving. And there could be no better person to share their insights with us than a gentleman who actually leads this study for us. I'm thrilled to welcome back my colleague and friend, Khalid Kark. Khalid, thank you so very much for
Hey, Dalibor, great to be here, and great to be with Canadian audiences again. Happy to be here and happy to run through the session.
Thank you so very much. So Khalid is our managing director, and he leads our global research. I'm going to let you, Khalid, describe sort of the history of our tech leadership study and let you take us away. For the audience members, we are planning for this session to be about an hour long, and we have reserved time for your questions. So certainly, if anything triggers your imagination or have a question to ask Khalid or myself, please submit your question using the Q&A function of this Zoom platform. We'll make sure towards the end to leave some time to answer your questions. So with that, Khalid, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dalibor. Again, it's a pleasure to be here and be talking about a topic that, of course, I'm really passionate about. So good to see you all, and happy to kind of connect with you. So before, as Dalibor said, there's a history for this Global Tech Leadership Study. We started this in earnest in about 2015, where we started collecting globally data from multiple clients, usually over 1,000 clients, to understand the evolving role of a tech leader and how that's playing out. What are some of the changes? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the issues that those tech leaders are dealing with? So we've been doing this for several years now, and of course we've got some interesting trend data, we've got some interesting changes, but one thing on the onset I'll say, we've been doing this for a while, but this last study was very different from what we saw previously. There was a consistent trend of where leadership was going, tech leadership specifically was going, what the expectations were, what the mandate was. But I think the pandemic and a whole host of other forces just changed that tremendously. And so we're gonna share some of those changes, and we're gonna talk about some of the shifts that we're starting to see in the role of a tech leader. So as Dalibor said, if you have a question, a comment, or a thought, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to capture it and address it as we go along, and we'll keep some time at the end for questions as well. So let me dive in and kind of get you a sense of what we're seeing in terms of the role of a tech leader. As Dalibor said, we've published, this year we are going to publish a series of reports that capture the essence of different parts of this leadership journey. We published 2 reports. We're planning on publishing another 2 in the coming months, and we want to make sure that as we kind of talk about those things, we're here to share with you some of the things that are published, some of the things that are maybe not published. So some of this is a sneak preview into some of the other pieces that are coming up. This is kind of a overall summary of what were some of the findings. So let me dive in. This is a global report, as I said, typically over 1,000 respondents. This year we conducted about 100 interviews. The distribution across different geographies across the globe fairly consistent. And then industry as well is fairly diverse. And lastly, I'd just say revenue breakdown is also, we tried to kind of keep it where we get to hear and see from all sizes of companies. And of course, there were some differences by size of company, by geography, by industry, and those were minor, and those were specific to certain contextual things. We're not going to talk about those. We are talking broadly about overall trends, but if anybody has any particular questions around individual geography or industry, et cetera, I'm happy to kind of give you at least an initial thought or perspective if there was any difference in the data set in that case.
So, Khalid, isn't that what you just said, that while you surveyed organizations across the world with different industries and different sizes, you said, yes, there were some differences, but majority of what you're finding is consistent. Isn't that in and of itself an interesting finding, eh?
It absolutely is. In fact, 2015, when we did it the first time, our plan was to actually cut the data by industry, geography, and size of company and say, hey, here's how the differences are between different types of CIOs. And that whole plan went down the drain because when we got the data back, it was fairly consistent. A CIO was a CIO was a CIO across industries, across geographies, even size of companies. There was very little differences. And so that was a little bit of an aha for us, that the leadership for technology doesn't change too much as you go across industries or as you go across geographies. Yeah, I mean, I think the only big difference is the allocation of capital. And so spending as a percentage of revenue varies by industry significantly. And it varies from anywhere from a little over 1% to over 10%, right? And so the actual pool of money spent on technology, that is probably the biggest difference that we see across industries. But other than that, I think the role remains the same, the issues remain the same, the challenges remain the same, and the way the CIO role is viewed and the mandate and the expectations also remain fairly consistent.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, and I want to put you on the spot. If you don't have the answer, that's fine. But I would be curious if you can let us know what industry is sort of percentage-wise typically highest spending as a percentage of revenue, and is it appropriate to call out the one that is at the other side of the spectrum?
Yeah, sure. So financial services, as you can imagine, is typically on the higher end as an industry. Within industries, tech, of course, or sectors, if you go into, for example, TMT has tech, media, and telecom. So tech specifically spends a lot more, a lot higher percentage. But other than tech, which is obvious, financial services tends to be close to 10%, depending on the type of company they are. On the flip side, I think in general, we find manufacturing to be on the lower end. And again, in some cases, some consumer companies where the margins are very thin tend to spend a little bit less. But again, it kind of, what was really fascinating was that every industry had leaders and laggards, right? And so every industry had people who were spending a lot. And by the way, spend doesn't equate to value. Value is a different conversation, but there were people who were spending a lot higher and a lot more than the average. And there were usually reasons for that, right? They're going through a large transformation. They have a huge technology bet that they're making, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I look at these numbers, I usually tell people that think of the budget benchmarks as a starting point, not necessarily as a way for you to achieve that benchmark, because the benchmarks could be misleading, and
Yep.
your particular circumstances may require you to spend a lot more or a lot less, depending on where you are in that cycle, and your strategy or corporate strategy, and so on and so forth. And so it's a good starting point, but I wouldn't put a lot on the budget benchmarks. Of
What
course,
you
we
also
publish
said,
those,
what you
but
also said, I think is really important, that the amount of spent
yeah,
is not equal to the amount of value generated. And I already know, of course, you and I spoke about this recently. We are going to talk about the findings on value, and we're going to talk about the findings about data monetization, which is part of that value as well,
right.
in one of those sessions in August, in one of
Yes.
these sessions in August. So we are, as this report shapes up, we'll be bringing it back to our audiences later on in about a couple of months.
Yeah, and again, I think to me, that's the most fascinating part of all of this is how do you measure, how do you articulate, and how do you execute the value that is being promised through technology? Yeah. A lot of investments been made during pandemic, post-pandemic, and a lot of business leaders are now looking for technology leaders to step up and share what they've done and how they've kind of delivered value based on those investments. So yeah, I think I'm looking forward to that session as well. Okay, so let's jump right in. As I said, we've been kind of collecting this data for a while, and what we've seen is fairly consistent view of three types of CIOs at any given point in time. You're either a trusted operator, a business co-creator, or a change instigator. Of course, you can shift between these, but at any given point in time, your primary mandate used to be one of these three, right? So either you're being asked to really drive consistent, efficient, secure, reliable tech environment, and that's your primary mandate, or you're being asked to drive a large transformational change, whether that's an ERP or some other kind of organization-wide, enterprise-wide change, or your role is a co-creator where you're actually co-creating solutions, co-creating growth opportunities for the business, where you're not told, here's the strategy, go execute it. You're part of the decision making around the future of your business. And so you are playing one of these three roles at any given point in time. And the answers, by the way, we never asked the question, are you a business co-creator or a trusted operator? We would have gotten some skewed responses if we'd asked the CIOs of that. But really, I think it was really easy based on, I mean, we did clustering analysis on the back end based on a number of permutations and combinations. And it was easy to put people in these categories and say, you know what, there generally are a third of the CIOs that tend to fall into business co-creator category, and maybe about 10%, 12%, something like that in the change instigator category, and then a little over a 50% falling in business the trusted operator category. And of course, their mandates were pretty clear at any given point in time. But by the way, as I said, people shift between these. There were very significant business co-creator for a decade. They acquired a company almost their size, and so the business co-creator had to be a trusted operator for a year as they did the integration and so on, right? And so you kind of shift between these patterns depending on your role and your mandate and so on. And that was fairly consistent until 2020. And by the way, this data was right before, as the pandemic was hitting, we were just finishing up our data analysis and putting this together. So this is right before the pandemic hit. Now, what we saw as we started to capture data in the fall of 2022, for the next iteration of this study, we saw something very, very different. What we saw was this, which is there's very little pattern in this. There is a huge desire and an expectation for CIOs to do all of the above. We asked them, what are your top areas where you're spending your time, effort, energy? And that was the question that was a determinant in many cases in the past for us to figure out which kind of category you fell in the past. But this year, the answers were all over the place in terms of what the expectations were and where tech leaders were spending their time. So if you look at it from left to right, they were being asked to drive digital strategy, but also being asked to drive strategy execution. They were asked to drive innovation, but also operational reliability, asked to kind of think about stakeholder influence, but also think about architecture and infrastructure and platforms, and so on and so forth, right? And so the idea is that this time, more than any other time before, we saw this huge, what I call the dispersion in the role of a CIO. There is no real clear mandate that you're a trusted operator or a business co-creator. You're all of the above. You got to do all of the above. And in fact, you got to have capabilities doing all of the above. I mean, one CIO we talked to commented this operational reliability and delivery. If you don't have a strong team doing this for you, you're going to spend 100% of your time doing this. And so figuring out the competencies within your tech function and figuring out the team that's going to help you with all of these becomes essential, becomes really, really important, and almost a determinant for your success as a tech leader. And so this, as I said, was a little bit eye-opening for us to see this dispersion in the role, which we hadn't seen to the extent before. Of course, data management and analytics became a big part of the conversation, which it wasn't 2.5 years ago when we did the last year study and so on. So let me get to the next slide, and Dalibor, I know maybe you have a question, but let me get to the next slide and then
sure.
we'll pause. Yeah.
What I was going to say is that what you just shared suggests that a tech leader who sits at the very top of these different capabilities also, I think, needs to have a very healthy dose of self-awareness so that they actually understand themselves, where is their area of strength and where is their blind spot, and then be able to really map out the capability around them, built out in such a way that, you know, that whom they choose to be around them truly supplements and complements their particular strengths, right? Because being a strategist is a different skill set from being an operator. Being a change agent and driver for, you know, catalyst for that change and transformation is a different, even personality than those focused on, you know, governing and protecting. So this is a very interesting. This is you're right. It's dispersing and elevating at the same time.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of questions in there. One is what was the most surprising thing for me in this study, and I think the surprise was that the patterns that held true for a good 6 years as we collected the data don't hold true anymore. And I think that was really the aha for me, is that the role has changed significantly from the traditional trajectory that it was on. Pandemic, this becomes almost an inflection point for tech leaders to chart a course that's very different from where the trajectory was taking them, which was a certain pace, certain expectation, certain way of doing things. I think this has kind of shifted the role, and because of that, the whole tech organization and leadership needs to act and behave differently than what was expected even 2 years ago, right? And so again, we'll talk more about that. And then there's a question on AI, and I'll get to that as I get to some of the different dimensions of the role. So let's get to the next one. So I talked about the dispersion, and this is what I call is the expansion in the role. And the expansion comes from the fact that all of those things that were in the previous slide were traditionally things that the tech function did, right? And so they're responsible for security, they're responsible for innovation, they were responsible for things like architecture and so on. But these are things that maybe the top ones, they still kind of fall in there, but things that traditionally are sit outside of the tech function or were kind of things that CIOs didn't spend a lot of time on traditionally. And so, of course, digital transformation is a big one. 52% of CIOs are saying they either own or drive it on behalf of the enterprise. Tech fluency, which is educating and equipping the organization, the whole enterprise around technology topics and technology capabilities. Then you've got innovation. I think the number is a little bit higher than what I expected it to be. Yep. 37% are saying they're either leading or co-leading this on behalf of their enterprise. And then it starts to get interesting. Data and analytics, about a third of CIOs are driving it and leading it on behalf of their enterprise. Customer experience, another 15%. Workforce. This is interesting. This is a net new capability that got added during pandemic, where it's not just about collaboration tools, or it's not just about productivity tools for the enterprise. It's actually CIO's role or tech leaders' role in reimagining the future of work, the future physical spaces. Again, 80% of office space today is being repurposed for collaboration spaces. So what technologies, what capabilities do you need to operate those types of physical spaces? What's automation going to do? How is automation going to change or differentiate jobs? How is AI going to help with that? How are collaboration tools in the context of work from home or hybrid environments going to work, and so on and so forth? And so it's actually CIO being very actively involved in rethinking the future of work for the enterprise. Strategic planning, again, is an obvious one, where CIOs during pandemic and post-pandemic are very actively involved in thinking through strategies for growth through technology and primarily tech-enabled services and capabilities. You've got ESG and then diversity, equity, inclusion, where that's going to increasingly take up a lot more time for a tech leader than they have in the past, especially ESG, and especially in Europe. There's a huge desire and an expectation for a tech leader to drive the monitoring and the tracking of some of the enterprise-wide initiatives through technology. And so as you look at this list, you not only see a dispersion that we saw in the previous slide where you're expected to do all of the above, your role is expanded significantly as well. And I think that's one of the reasons we saw this inflection point that I'm seeing in the role of a tech leader, where it's become very, very hard, as Dolliver said, for a single person to have all of these competencies built into them to be able to lead their enterprise. And so it's really interesting to see the diversity and the dispersion of what the expectations are of a tech leader. So I'll pause here for a second and see if any of that made sense, and I'll then start to go into some of the solutioning for. I've hopefully laid out the problem in spades. We'll get into kind of the solutioning part of it, unless there's any questions on the data that I presented here in the previous slide.
No, I think this is good, and it screams to me exactly those two words: dispersion and elevation. Right? This is, yeah, absolutely.
So let's start to think about what does this really mean for the tech function. And one of the things that we've been kind of experimenting with, toying with, et cetera, is this notion of an operating model within technology that can sustain these competencies independently. These 6 competencies are very distinct. They require very distinct skill sets. They require very distinct type of leadership, and they are actually trying to achieve very different outcomes. And so let's go through each one really quickly and kind of get a sense for what these are, and then we'll talk about how they are connected to each other. So engineer is the traditional role of a CIO, which is building, operating, optimizing the operations of the technology environment. The primary focus is efficiency and effectiveness, reliability, security, all of that kind of focuses on having a well-run, operationally efficient, and effective tech environment. And again, that's important. It includes engineering, it includes the building part of it, and the sustaining part of it, and the optimizing part of it, which is kind of your, again, of course, and now that you've got cloud providers and you got to manage some of those complexities. But ultimately, this is simply about making sure you've got a well-run tech environment in your enterprise. The second is the architect role, which again, you could call it a chief technology officer role. Their role, this leader is responsible for envisioning, for designing, for overseeing environments to ensure resiliency, which again has become significantly more important post-COVID as an expectation, and scalability, but increasingly also agility. We saw during COVID, you had to pivot very, very quickly. Is your infrastructure, is your architecture built to shift and pivot quickly based on business needs, based on environmental and social and political and regulatory changes that may come at you, and pandemics and so on, right? And so, and of course, this also role includes looking at emerging technologies and how they can help really better design capabilities for the enterprise to be resilient, to be scalable, to be agile. And of course, cloud providers play a fairly significant role here as well, not just in terms of scalability, but also in terms of agility. And so to kind of think about that and integrate that into the mix becomes really, really important. The data scientist, fairly new expectation, but a really important one. And this is not about just kind of coming up with a bright new ideas and insights based off of data. There's a whole host of, in fact, the dirty little secret here is that 80% of the work that goes on in the back end can equip you to actually be better on the front end in terms of tech assets. And so the collection, the management, the aggregation, the analysis of a lot of that data depends on how good your data is in the first place and how good you've been in terms of their hygiene and maintenance and management of it, et cetera. And then the last, or the next one is the change agent. And again, you could call it chief transformation officer, or chief digital officer, whatever it is, but really the competency here is change management, large transformational changes, instigating, managing, delivering large global transformational changes that are enterprise-wide. And again, they could be technology-oriented, it could be an ERP upgrade, or it could be a business model kind of rejigging, right? To be able to figure out where you're going to go in terms of growth capabilities or business areas and so on. And so whatever those capabilities are, it could be HR, it could be finance, it could be anything where you're shifting the existing operating model, business operating model to come to something new. And then the role is a change agent role. And technology has been doing it for a while and they're really good at it. And I think this role of a chief digital officer could be a misnomer at times. It could mean a whole host of things, but the way we're envisioning it here is really a primary change agent. And then the owner is really the business unit leader, business unit tech leader, business unit manager that has very deep understanding of the individual businesses and is able to preempt, not react, but preempt the changes in the business and provide capabilities, tech capabilities that are innovative, that are kind of focused on growth and the trajectory of the business and solving real complex business problems. And I think that role again is really important because At an enterprise level, you can create, innovate. The deep down business expertise required at a business level is especially for a multi group or multi-business enterprises, it becomes really important to have that conduit of an owner or business leader really driving it from a technology perspective. And the last one, of course, is the chief information security officer or chief risk officer or other names that it has. But they're primarily responsible for identification, assessment, prioritization, and management of risk on behalf of the enterprise. And it could include a whole host of things, not just cybersecurity only. But those are really distinct and independent roles that you cannot expect an engineer to be a risk manager. You cannot expect a change agent to be an architect. They are very distinct roles and require very significant expertise, understanding, leadership to be able to drive those competencies. Now, one question, and as we were discussing, Dalibor had this question, is how do they interact and how do these roles connect? And the answer is actually really simple. Conceptually, a lot harder to do in reality, but every person we talked to that had the one or more of these roles in their enterprises cautioned us, every tech leader and business leader cautioned us to say that do not let these competencies become independent silos. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we had the emergence of a chief digital officer role. I'll give you a real life example where a company started this digital function, and it started with like 37 people. It ended up having 1,200 people, where everybody from IT shifted over because that seemed to be the most exciting part of the business, where they were doing a whole host of interesting things. They had the budget, they had the capabilities, and so on and so forth. And because it was almost a competition between the traditional IT and the digital function, it just created infighting, politics, silos that led to a huge disaster in that enterprise. And so it's really important to think about these roles collectively as well, and having some kind of a leader, call it an Uber CIO, call it a chief, again, I'm starting to hear this term as well, chief digital information officer, whatever you want to call it. It is really a combination of all of these capabilities overseen by an entity that is able to ensure cohesion, integration, and capability building across some of these dimensions, serving the whole enterprise, not an individual silo. So,
you are so that was exactly so. So what you're saying is that in a modern enterprise, these 6 capabilities need to be in place. It's almost they have to be in place somehow. They have to be connected. And am I saying it correctly that for those enterprises that might be seen as leading or doing this well, these 6 happen to be overseen by an executive, a senior executive that you refer to Uber CIO? I don't know what the title will emerge, but certainly traditional CIO on the left field implies that just calling CIO is no longer reflective.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think and there is baggage attached to each one of these titles, right?
Yes.
So the traditional CIO or the CTO or the data and insights or chief digital officer, all of these names have some connotation, and often very different connotations with different people and different organizations, and that's why I'm not too hung up on what we call it. I think what's important is there needs to be some oversight that ensures coordination, cohesion, and integration of these roles across the enterprise in a horizontal way. These are vertical silos, and these competencies are especially important. Specialization is important, etc. But the goals and the outcomes need to be aligned to a single cohesive view for the enterprise. And I think that's the important thing for people to consider. I get this question all the time. How do I structure a CDO and a CIO? How do I structure a CTO and a CDO and all that? And I think names make less of a difference here, because a CTO in one organization could have a very different role from a CTO in another organization, even in the same industry, even same size companies, right? And it's less important. And that's why I highlighted the competency and not the role as much, right? It's the architect, the engineer, the data scientist. The competency is important. It's important to have clarity in what your mandate is, what your role is in achieving the ultimate outcome for the enterprise. But it is important to have some cohesion. Now, there was a question in there that talks about the fact that the traditional CIO growing up through the traditional role or a traditional business tech role, how do they kind of envision all this, and are they equipped to handle it, et cetera? And the answer is, as I saw, and I talked to a lot of business leaders, they are looking for people who have necessarily not all of these, but a couple of these, right? So a person, for example, having owner and engineer experience could have enough where they could lead a team to have architect and scientist and change agent really drive individual capabilities for them. Similarly, a change agent may be good with ownership. So all I'm saying is, as leaders, it's important for us to not try to do everything, but to at least have a couple of these under our belt, so that we're able to kind of provide that cohesive view to the enterprise in some way, and oversee all of these in a cohesive, consistent manner. If you have only one competency, it is going to be really hard for you as an Uber CIO to be able to manage all of these together in a cohesive manner. You'll always have that bias. And so it's important to kind of ensure and by the way, a lot of business leaders said that they're actually doing rotations for their high-performing CIOs to go into the business and work in the business for a couple of years, to go figure out in the CFO organization how the financing and funding works, et cetera, and then come back and then kind of run part of the tech function and so on. By the way, the one other thing that was interesting is, for data scientists and risk managers, about half of them sit outside of IT, right? And so in a lot of organizations, it's not uncommon to have the chief data officer sit outside of IT, or chief risk manager sit outside of IT, or CISO sit outside of IT. In some cases, digital actually sits outside of IT. And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, or that's going to be a disaster. I think if there is lack of integration between those roles, there is going to be disaster. As long as you figure out a way to have cohesion and consistency and integration around those capabilities, it becomes easy. But otherwise, it could become a disaster really quickly.
Very good. Many of these roles actually emerged in business, partially as a frustration, I think. It was out of frustration. Agree. And now where we have landed is these 6 clear capabilities that constitute the sum total of what every enterprise should be thinking as they deliver technology insights and digitization. Like, this is, people could think of this as their first step of imagining a comprehensive operating model, for example.
Exactly.
Right?
And then the next question is, do I need to have C-suite executives for all 6 of them? And the answer is no, you don't have to have all of them as C-suite executives. What you do need is somebody accountable for the architecture, somebody accountable for being a change agent, somebody accountable for bringing in the business side of things, et cetera. And ultimately, I feel if you're missing 1 or 2 or 3 of these areas, you're doing a disservice to your enterprise, because your competition is already thinking about all 6 of these. And so to look at the role of a tech leader today in a cohesive manner, you got to have these things, and you don't have to have C-suite executives for all of those. Maybe your strategy dictates that you got to have an engineer and a data scientist and an owner, and those are the real C-suite leaders. The others are supporting roles, and that's completely fine. But again, think about your strategic view. Think about what capabilities can create competitive differentiation for you, and where you're going to invest your capabilities, invest your resources and budgets and dollars to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. Okay, so I know we spent a lot of time on this, but I think this grounding was important for us to kind of move on to the next shift, which is really and again, we have slides for each one of those, and we may not go through each one of those slides, but I wanted to give you a sense for the shifts that we're starting to see. So the last slide was, how do you think about and structure and organize and so on and so forth. And then there is the notion of okay, what is the shift? What did pandemic do? And these shifts are across the board. These are kind of horizontal shifts, irrespective of the role that you're playing, whether you are an owner or an architect or a data scientist. It doesn't matter. You got to think, and some of these shifts apply more to you than others and so on, but all of these shifts need to happen horizontally for you. This is a mindset shift for your technology function and your people in your technology function. And we can go through kind of these very high level, and then we can go into detail for a couple of them.
Yeah, sure.
But really, I mean, I think the first one is business partnership. Partnership has this notion of two things coming together. I think that notion is gone. What business is expecting is to have an integrated technology view into everything that they're doing. And by the way, the outcome that they're looking for is not that technology is going to deliver something to them. It's actually synchronizing the bits with the atoms of the business, right? And the bits and the atoms are, is technology going to help me figure out my supply chain conundrum, right? Is technology going to get products on the shelves of our stores in time for us to optimize the supply chain and the capabilities that go behind it, et cetera? Is this technology going to give us better health outcomes in a healthcare environment, right? And so how is technology going to help us synchronize our businesses for growth, for opportunity, for optimization, and so on and so forth? So very different role. It goes way beyond the business co-creator role that we talked about early on. It's actually integrated into the business to be able to synchronize the business, not technology, but the business. So a mandate has shifted significantly. Innovation to monetization. Innovation was a big buzzword all throughout 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, where tech was spending a lot of time, effort, energy, trying to look at bright, shiny objects, trying to do small team experiments and trying to figure out which technologies are going to help, et cetera. Those days are gone. As we talked to CIOs, 100 of them, all of them said there's huge pressure on me to now kind of show value from the investments that we've made in the past. Days of science experiments and bright, shiny objects are gone. It is actually, you're going to only invest in capabilities that are going to help us either deliver value very differently or help us monetize the tech and the data assets that we've got. So very targeted investments in technology capabilities, only the ones that are able to generate significant value or monetization. Customers and workforce to experiences. This used to be only customers, right? So you focus on creating an app, you focus on creating some kind of a tech capability that your customers are interacting with, et cetera. Those days are gone, right? And of course, now we've included workforce as part of it, because workforce experience is probably as important, if not more important, than the customer experience. And so the capability that you're building, and almost every organization is in there trying to figure out the end-to-end experience and creating multi-dimensional, multifunctional teams that are responsible and accountable for the end-to-end experience. No more creating an app and throwing it over the wall to the sales and marketing function to be able to run it. It's actually you're being held accountable end-to-end to create, to deliver, and to figure out the outcomes based on the experiences, whether it's the workforce or the customers. From data to insights, again, a fairly obvious one, and a really important one because our data is suggesting that 80% of enterprises don't have their data in order to be able to deliver insights. That's a huge number. That requires a huge effort on the data side to be able to figure out. Of course, you can get better tools. Of course, those tools can figure out kind of ways to slice and splice the data in a way that gives you interesting stuff. But the fundamental issue there remains that we don't have good data to work off of, and therefore we can't get good insights. And so our data suggests that we're way, way behind in this particular area. If we're going to monetize, if we're going to deliver insights, we got to ensure that our data is really kind of supporting that capability. From transformation to value creation, again, transformation for the sake of transformation to very tactical and tangible value levers that are iterative, and making sure that you've got an MVP and that kind of builds on it, and then you create iterative value as opposed to creating a large kind of Uber transformation and having a multi-year, multi-million-dollar investment to find out 3 years later that that wasn't really the thing the business was looking for. So those days are gone. And then from cybersecurity to resilience, this is, again, seems like a no-brainer, but I'll just give you one example, which is a really powerful one where one of the CIOs for a large Fortune 50 company went to their CEO right before pandemic, this was January, and said, you know, if this pandemic thing plays out, we're going to lose about 14% of our manufacturing capacity. So you may want to start to think about planning for that, et cetera. And CEO, of course, didn't pay too much attention to it. He's like, well, I think it's going to go away or whatever. And then in June, the CEO came back to the CIO and said, how were you able to get to that 14% number? In reality, we actually had about 15% disruption in our manufacturing capacity. And so this was a CIO proactively really driving a resilience capability, not a cybersecurity thing, but to predict the disruptions in the business and being able to kind of drive that to the business level is the type of role that, and by the way, that CIO is now CIO and head of the predictions business for the business, right? And so from governance to co-creation, this is a really complex topic, but the summary here is that technology has multiple things. You take digital, you take large transformations, you take tech, just tech investments, and there are multiple stakeholders, business stakeholders, C-suite stakeholders, other stakeholders, and governance of technology. There is no clarity on who owns the oversight, who owns the capital allocation, and who owns the prioritization of resources. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier said than done. Every organization has a governance structure. Very, very few have an effective one. And I think as we spend more on technology, as technology becomes more complex, if we don't address our governance structure where it moves from just being governance, which is putting guardrails around things, to co-creation and to be able to drive the business forward in terms of growth, that can become a roadblock and a bottleneck for a lot of tech investments. And I think that's an important one for many organizations to start to get fixed if they want capital allocation and the value to be driven through tech for that. Then you've got op model to future of work. We kind of talked about that already. And then you've got legacy core modernization to cloud orchestration. This is an interesting one where a lot of companies have got multiple cloud providers now. And the issue is, how are you going to have them talk to each other, where instinctively they don't want to talk to each other, right? And so there is that middle layer that you need to build to be able to have that capability, to have visibility, to have the ability to integrate and have an integrated view of some of your environment across cloud providers becomes a really interesting and an important challenge. And then the last one is it used to be tech was only focused on the end user experience. Of course, that has shifted. Immersive internet for the enterprise is a reality. We have this year's tech trends, one of the tech trends focuses on it. Huge investments going on in terms of not just the metaverse, but different forms of interaction and different forms of where your customers and your clients are, and you showing up there to be able to serve them in a context that goes way beyond the traditional role of IT. And so in that, I mean, gaming industry alone is bigger than the streaming industry, the kind of all the online interaction capabilities that we have. And so just showing up there in different ways to be able to drive your product, to be able to integrate and interact with your customers becomes a real challenge unless you're starting to think about it now. So again, we can go into each one in a lot more detail, but I'm not going to belabor that point. I know we have a few questions, and I'd rather kind of answer those questions than go into.
I agree. And by the way, Khalid, what we did agree, like what follows are the details of each one of these trends, each one of these shifts. So we're going to share the deck with the audience after.
Just to give you a sense for this is kind of for each of those, we've got a slide like this that goes into a lot of detail on why we're saying that's a trend and what we're seeing specific to that trend.
Yeah, that's excellent. So we'll be sharing that with everyone. We have actually a really, really powerful question that is asking, how do you actually gain support from the executives to get to this stage, where there is a realization of the need to have these capabilities properly established, properly funded, properly orchestrated, to help executives think themselves about these mandate shifts. So the question further goes, consulting firms like ours have the high-level thought leadership, but in this particular gentleman's experience, that thought leadership hasn't permeated throughout the company. I'm going to assume the client organization. Not only do these executives struggle to support us, they actually push against these ideas. Do you have any advice on how to get the support we need in today's fast-paced world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. If you're a cynical person, you would say they either get it or they don't. I think where I've seen this work really well is two things. I think one, you look for the small wins. You build trust. You become a trusted partner. As I said, I mean, the Fortune 50 CIO who went to the CEO and said, we're going to lose business capacity here. Or you go to another CIO, again, Fortune 100 company. They started, they had this huge bottleneck in terms of a part of their business, and they created a tool for that business to optimize warehousing in their context. Now, that tool was so good that nobody in the industry had that tool. And now this company is white labeling that tool to the competitors. And oh, by the way, they have their data too for some of the collection of that combined data, of course, not specific data, but aggregated data. And so that gives them not just the competitive advantage, but a revenue stream, right? And so what you look for is small wins that are business wins, not technology wins, that are business wins, where you need a partner or a couple of partners from the business side to be able to prove that you can actually have a significant impact on the business. And once you start to build that trust, it becomes a lot easier for you to then propose and educate them on different elements. Now, there is a prerequisite for that. And the prerequisite is that you got to be able to understand the business sometimes a lot deeper than a lot of the other business folks, right? You got to understand the technology capabilities that can help solve a business challenge and a problem better than anybody else. And so, of course, you've got a great vantage point in tech, but I would say start with small wins and build trust over time. The second thing is to create a formal and informal tech fluency program for your senior leadership. I think this is public. Capital One, for example, has any leader that needs to shift from one level to the next leader needs to have a certain amount of technical competence, and they have to go through certain training in technology to be able to shift. And so I think you don't have to be that formal, but having a focused program around tech awareness and leadership is huge for a lot of these conversations to follow on with.
Khalid, I will add one more, third one. When you reflect on the initial slides you shared, there was a expectation of stakeholder engagement. And yes. I think that a technology leader today who aspires to be driving this has to be showing up as a business executive with credible suite of executive relationships that are healthy, that they have their mentors, their champions, their advocates at the executive suite. So investment in building executive relationships is critical, because these decisions, whoever asked that question very correctly, these decisions, these choices will actually be approved or not at that executive table, perhaps by the CEO or by the chief operating officer. So you need to have them on board.
Absolutely. And in fact, the tech fluency is part of the stakeholder influence,
correct.
Right? You got to educate them to be able to have the influence, to have those conversations and so on. Completely agree.
Another question that was actually embedded within this, the capabilities of consulting firms. So the comment was, many consulting firms have a theoretical knowledge of this, but they do not have the capability to actually help the client deliver. To me, this actually is an important one to address. So yes, there are organizations that specialize in specific domains, and there are organizations that have the breadth and depth. So I think that the answer there is to actually choose appropriately for what you need. Be very well informed of what you will be buying as you bring different consulting organizations to help, and think in the context of the ecosystem. Think in the context of the ecosystem, because it might just not be possible, practical, or financially viable to be building internally all these capabilities. You actually need to think about, how do you gain access to competencies and skills, as opposed to how do I build my team that wears my badge for all of these six.
100% agree. In fact, I would say that for any one of them, the assumption is not that you're going to build them in-house, right? So you find the best mechanism to build these capabilities, whether through your ecosystem or in-house. The other thing I'd just say to kind of add to your point, Dalibor, for each one of these things on the right, we work internally with our practitioners to make sure that we have something that can help the client in each one of those areas. By the way, including the metaverse, right? And I know that there's a question on metaverse and the fact that whether it's a fad or not. And the fact is not the fact that it's the metaverse. The fact is that it's going to be an immersive internet for the enterprise that is going to manifest itself in multiple ways. And I'm not saying you got to shift everything there yet, but what I am saying, that shift is coming. And you need to start to think about how you're going to show up in those multi kind of faceted, immersive tools and technologies, whether that's for your training, and how they're going to help you, whether you're for your training, whether that's for other capabilities. In fact, about 20% of the companies are exploring immersive technologies as a training mechanism right now as we speak, right? And so the fact is, you got to start to think about those shifts today for you to be able to get equipped and to be able to help the business leaders understand the enormity of the challenge that you're addressing by shifting from one to the other.
Khalid, this was absolutely fantastic. Like it actually captured and provided essence of what I think many of us feel is organized and disciplined way. So thank you so very much. We are out of time. The plug, of course, here is that for every one of these transformations and transitions, we actually have a lot of things to say, including practices that can help. So explore more, please feel free to email me back and we will connect you with the right individual for each one of those particular topics. I hope you actually enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. 2 weeks from now, on June the 14th, we're going to reconvene and talk about the ecosystem and how modern technology leaders and modern successful organizations actually are engaging with the ecosystem to create value. So 2 weeks from now, June the 14th, we'll be back. I will invite you to rejoin us to have that conversation about the ecosystem. The recording will be shared with everyone, and so will the deck. So thank you all very much for your time. Khalid, thank you especially for finding time to be with us. This was fantastic. And have yourself a lovely Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.